Young and Crazy, 1987, Chapter 3. 1987. Metal kept getting bigger and my fandom kept getting deeper. I was hungry for more metal and I was ready to take some chances. There were some bands that just weren't getting any video or radio play, but their album covers were screaming my name from the racks in the music stores. One of the first bands I bought without ever hearing their music was Tiger Tails from the UK. The cover of Young and Crazy had glam goodness plastered all over it. Purple and pink colors with enough hairspray and makeup to give Poison a run for their money. They produced a punky, heavy glam sound that had more in common with Too Fast for Love than Look What the Cat Dragged In. J. Pepper provided the sleazy guitar riffs with a hard-driving rhythm section consisting of Pepsi Tay on bass and Ace Fincham on drums. Vocalist Stevie James had such a unique voice. I loved how he could sound like two different singers in one song, mostly singing in a lower register than other singers of that time, then throwing some lines out there in a high-end screech. They made some glam metal magic together, but James was outed early on for being too crazy and rock and roll 24/7. I addressed his exit from the band on the podcast with all the surviving original members. Here's J. Pepper. Quote, when Stevie joined, he really pushed that glam image. In doing so, we got noticed even more. We were all pretty wild in those days, but I think Stevie pushed it a little harder than most. He would get into a lot of violent scrapes. When the album came out, he confronted a journalist who gave us a not-so-favorable review. The record company said, this can't happen. You can't have him doing these kind of things. They pushed us to replace him. It was unfortunate because he was a great frontman with a lot of charisma and creativity. End quote. Here's Stevie James. Quote, them saying I was fighting with journalists and got into a lot of scrapes? No, that's bullocks. Well, some of it's true. I upset some journalists. The one I vividly remember was at the Marquee. The guys in Tiger Tails were egging me on to blow some smoke in the guy's face. So I took a big cigar and I blew smoke in his face because he gave us an unfavorable review. I never punched any journalists. That's an absolute lie. I may have upset a few because I was defending the band and they were backing me up on it. It's almost like they were setting me up to fall like a scapegoat. The management and the head of the record company, Music for Nations, absolutely hated me. He had me in the office all the time. He was saying, this has got to stop. I told him we were getting publicity and selling records out of it. So we had done some demos and the head of the label said they were a bunch of rubbish and they had to get rid of me. A lot of people around the band were hating on me and it still goes on today, which I find unfair. The only crime I committed is bringing that band out of the bingo halls and working man's clubs and out to the front. End quote. Here's Ace Fincham. Quote, Stevie did have fights with the press and stuff like that, but it really came down to Jay and Pepsi wanted to get rid of him. Stevie is my best friend. I've known him since 1980. I didn't want to go along with it. We had a meeting where they sat me down and they had me listen to Kim Hooker singing Living Without You. I thought it was great. I really did. That's what they wanted to do. They wanted to go with Kim. Stevie was my mate, though. I couldn't imagine being in a band without him. Once Jay decides on something, that's how it goes. They got rid of him that day and I refused to go. I went home and I let them do it. I didn't want to get rid of him. Initially, me and Stevie were going to do another band, but I was getting a paycheck at that time. I didn't have to work a regular job anymore. Ultimately, I had to tell Stevie I couldn't leave Tiger Tails because of the money. End quote. There was another album cover that was sparking my curiosity. It featured a long-haired dude painted up like a tiger and locked inside a neon blue cage. You probably guessed it was Inside the Electric Circus by Wasp. I had never heard Wasp, but staring at this madness made me want to. I bought it, cranked it, and was not disappointed, although I may have been a little creeped out at first by that circus intro music. Blackie Lawless had a nasty, raspy, but amazing metal voice. I thought the lineup with Blackie, Chris Holmes, Johnny Rod, and Steve Riley was just outstanding. I quickly fell in love with Wasp, and I went back and bought all their previous releases. Soon I was rocking out Wasp t-shirts like the Last Command album art and that cool one from Electric Circus that had all the guys in black leather and with sunglasses. I bought the Live at the Lyceum VHS and had the giant poster loaded with all the live shots from their 1984 tour. I obviously picked up Electric Circus late. Don't go there with me on the dates, man. I know it came out in 1986. And before I knew it, they had a new live album out called Live in the Raw. Long Beach Arena, they have returned. Hands down, one of the best live albums of the 80s. I don't think I've air drummed harder to any other album in history. There are rumors out there that the band re-recorded a lot of this album in the studio. Wait, bands did that? Haha. Oh, and Scream Until You Like It, kicks all kinds of ass. As you could imagine, I was pretty hyped when I had that yellow Iron Bird wielding bassmaster, Johnny Rod, on the Metalcast. I asked him about how he got into Wasp and the Live in the Raw album. Here's Johnny Rod. Quote, when we did the second King Cobra album, there was a lot of political bullshit going on at Capitol Records and they dropped us. We went on a tour with Wasp and Ted Nugent. At that time, Blackie Lawless was thinking about making a change and going to guitar, and I didn't know that. He told me after that he was watching me play every night on that tour. I get home and I find out that Capitol is dropping King Cobra. At the same time, management called to see if I'd be interested in talking with Blackie and checking things out. So I'm like, what the hell? One thing led to another, and I ended up playing on Inside the Electric Circus. Live in the Raw was great. It was recorded at Long Beach Arena in 1987. It wasn't re-recorded in the studio. Now, some songs were recorded on a different night at the California Theater in San Diego. That's where we recorded Manimal and Harder Faster. They were definitely actually live. End quote. I was buying so much stuff, it was just hard to keep track of it all. Pride, Once Bitten, Tell No Tales. Don't worry, there's a whole section on TNT coming up, Freely's Comet, and Visual Lies. Speaking of Once Bitten by Great White, I had guitarist Mark Kendall on the podcast. Talked about the struggles the band faced early in their career and how Once Bitten was a make-or-break moment for the band. Here's Mark Kendall. Quote, our first label, EMI, didn't want to deal with us anymore. They said they owed us another record, but they wouldn't push it. We didn't want to waste our music, so we were kind of dropped and we kind of left. We went through all of 1985 without a record deal. Then an A&R guy from Capitol, the father company of EMI, came down to one of our shows. He signed us that night to Capitol. At that time, we had put out a record of our own called Shot in the Dark. We had borrowed money and made deals for studio time for that one. Capitol put their name on Shot in the Dark, but didn't really push it. We only did 4 shows after we got signed, and they told us to go make another record. That's when we came up with Rock Me, Lady Red Light, and all those songs. That was the first time we made a record from scratch for a label without having to give them demos to get signed. It was our second opportunity on a major label, and it was do or die for us. We were very lucky. We got a big hit with Rock Me, and the rest is history. End quote. Another thing that stood out to me was that Dokken 12-inch single for Dream Warriors. Awesome cover art with Freddy Krueger on there. The slightly eerie and powerful Dream Warriors will always be my favorite Dokken song. Don told me on the podcast how the opportunity came up to do a song for the movie, and we touched on the Back for the Attack album as well. Here's Don Dokken. Quote, they approached us because the director was a Dokken fan. It was probably the only song in my career where someone told me what the chorus had to say. They told me the movie is called Dream Warriors. I told them I didn't know what that means. They sent us a rough edit of the movie and of the script, so we watched it and came up with Dream Warriors. I told George it was a monster movie. He wrote that dark guitar riff. Back for the Attack was a good record, one of our heaviest. We were in the zone. I think we had more freedom on that one. We didn't have to commit to writing singles like we did on the past couple albums. That allowed us to be heavier. End quote. Yes, of course, I had Hysteria and Appetite for Destruction. I'd be a fool to say these weren't important albums for the genre. I just never got huge into either band. The more people raved and the bigger these albums got, the less interested I was. I guess I was getting more into lesser-known bands like Keel. Keel certainly earned their right to rock with Ron Keel's distinct high vocal screams, the dual shredding of Mark Ferrari and Brian J., and the solid rhythm section of Kenny Chase on bass and Dwayne Miller on drums. Based on the music videos I had seen and the Gene Simmons producer connection, I picked up the right to rock and the Final Frontier. I remember distinctly that I got the Final Frontier on vinyl from the Cheapy rack, and it had a cut corner. Those albums were cool, but it was their self-titled 1987 album that completely blew me away. The songs were catchy as hell with gigantic background vocals. I was always dumbfounded on how this album didn't get big. I had a pleasure of talking about this masterpiece with the band. Here's Ron Keel. Quote, being that it was all digital, we had unlimited tracks. It was the first time we had no restrictions. For United Nations, we had 75 voices. We invited our friends from Rough Cut, Lion, people from the label, and the publicist. We had a big party because we wanted it to feel like their album too. So we had 75 people and we doubled it like 100 times. We set the Guinness Book of World Records for most background vocals on a rock recording. Yeah, it's a little over the top. End quote. Here's Dwayne Miller. Quote, the whole recording experience was really cool. Michael Wagner was always funny. A lot of different recording techniques were used. We had like 40 mics on the drums. Then the vocals, everything was like Bohemian Rhapsody with 50,000 freaking vocal harmonies on it. Every guy did all the parts. Then we tripled it and quadrupled it. It seems like overkill, but it sounds really good. End quote. Mark Ferrari shared some thoughts on why he thought the album wasn't bigger and why he exited Keel. Quote, we thought we had made a really solid record. It was pretty slick with Michael Wagner producing it. I thought it had some pretty radio-friendly songs on it as well. By album 4, we were firing on all cylinders. Success in the music industry is like running a relay race. The band takes the first lap and passes the baton to the marketing and promotion guys. Then they have to take their lap too. Sometimes the baton gets dropped, and that's what happened in our case. We had come off the Bon Jovi tour in 1987, playing our biggest shows ever. 3 weeks later, we're playing dingy clubs with no support from the label. We weren't signed through MCA directly. We were signed to Gold Mountain Records. Gold Mountain was looking to do a deal with Atlantic. Atlantic had an A&R person there and had opinions on what the next moves for Keel should be. I agreed with some of them and Ron didn't. I am a heavy rock guy and Ryan wanted to bring in a keyboard player. I was totally against that. Rather than be a thorn in Ron's side, I decided to step aside. I was confident in my own abilities and knew I would land on my feet, which I did. Through it all, I maintained my friendship with the guys, and there was no mudslinging. End quote. Speaking of Bon Jovi, they released Wanted Dead or Alive as a single in 1987. Obviously, the whole Slippery When Wet album was very influential to the scene. I do think Wanted Dead or Alive is the first time we hear the bluesy cowboy thing coming into hair metal. Would there have been an Every Rose Has its Thorn without it? I guess we'll never know. A lot of bands did seem to get bluesier as the 80s trucked along. Some bands tried to do an album every year, but most followed a 2-year cycle. It became a constant alternating flow of new albums. For the 85 albums that I bought in 86, I didn't get to experience buying them the day they were released. For months, I got to read in Metal Edge and other magazines all about the progress my two favorite bands, Motley Crue and Kiss, were making on their new albums. Now in this glorious year of 1987, and I would get to be a release day buyer of Girls, Girls, Girls and Crazy Nights. Let's just say it was exciting as hell getting some new stuff from my boys to digest, but I don't think I believe then or now that these were greater than their predecessors. It was a treat to get posters and shirts based on the new album designs, though. There were a slew of new music videos as well. It's funny the contrast of sounds on these two albums. Kiss was poppy and overloaded with keyboards, with successful Heart producer Ron Nevison at the helm. The Crue had a stripped-down, dirtier, guitar-driven mix, once again produced by Tom Werman. Motley again was leading the pack with The Image, replacing the feminine glam with the grittier denim and leather look. Of course, all the other bands would follow. Now I just had to catch one of these bands live. August 30th, 1987, my first concert. Motley Crue and Whitesnake at the Utica Auditorium. Is this a starting point or what? The two biggest hair metal bands together on the same bill. My dad was a good sport taking me to this. My mom, God rest her soul, was worried about me going. She kept saying I would get hit in the head with a beer bottle. I did not see any beer bottles whipping by, thankfully. Whitesnake didn't have a ton of stage room, but they made great use of what they had. They sounded just like the record. I had their 1987 album at this point, obviously. The whole Whitesnake thing confused me at the time. They released a self-titled album and were an opening band. Are they a new band? David Coverdale sure as hell didn't look like a young man. Were they some kind of supergroup with former members of Quiet Riot and Dio in there? Obviously, as more interviews came out, it started to make a little more sense. Then you open the tape and there's a totally different lineup listed in there. Rudy Sarzo came on the Metalcast and shared what he knew about the inner conflict going on in the band before he got there. Here's Rudy Sarzo. Quote, when I left Quiet Riot in 1985, I got a call from Whitesnake's management. I was in the middle of putting a band together with Tommy Aldridge. We went over to their management's office and they made us an offer to join the band. Since I toured with Whitesnake, they opened for Quiet Riot in 1984, I knew about the inner conflicts that were going on within the band, so I knew there would be a new band shortly. I passed on it because I was just getting out of one situation and didn't want to join another situation. I believe if I would have joined them in 1985, I would have never made it past the recording of the record. Nobody from that record survived." End quote. Motley Crue was just sensory overload for an 11-year-old kid. Fire, spinning drums, and 3 crazy madmen running around playing my favorite songs at a deafening volume. Just crank the Wild Side video and it will give you a great idea of what was going on. Motley were good, but even as a kid I could tell something was up with Vince's vocals. I thought his voice sounded a lot higher pitched than it did on the records. My dad and I thought Whitesnake sounded better, but the show of the Crue couldn't be touched. I picked up the tour shirt where Alistair Fiend is ripping through the top of the arena. Shirts were just another key piece to this whole scene. It's how you showed people what you were all about, and it definitely would lead to conversations and making friends, or getting picked on. A tour shirt that you couldn't get in the store was like bragging rights. Haha, loser, I went to the show and you had to stay home. Malls always had shops that specialized in metal shirts and back patches. Even department stores got into the mix peddling these things. I remember buying the Rat Reach for the Sky shirt at an old department store called Ames. One time I went to the mall with friends and I came home with a Poison shirt that had a cartoonish version of Look What the Cat Dragged In on the front. When my mom walked by me and saw what it said on the back, she flipped. "Talk dirty to me? You're not going out in public with that." This is coming from the same woman who took me to the record store and bought me Animal Fuck Like a Beast a few months earlier. Headbangers Ball was the weekly celebration of our music. World premieres, guest hosts, and tour reports. It was definitely my favorite thing on TV. Seems like the show was synonymous with sleepovers. You didn't want to be the first one to fall asleep and miss something cool or be the victim of a prank. You had to have the VHS recording as a backup no matter what. Videos were a great way not to only tell a song's story, but to see what a band's image and live tour would look like for that album. Most importantly, it was a way to discover new bands. I remember seeing Indians by Anthrax constantly. It was a little heavier than what I was used to, but I think the look and voice of Joey Belladonna made it feel similar enough. So I bought Among the Living. Wow, it was way different than the glam metal that I had been listening to. Wicked heavy and fast, lots of swearing, and those nasty-ass gang vocals. It was my first exposure to thrash, and I loved it. Oh, and I thought Adam Curry and Ricky Rackman were both cool. I won't choose. Most people believe Dio put out their greatest efforts with their first 2 albums. For me, Dream Evil was the era I got into Dio, and it was a trip to talk to guitarist Craig Goldie about his journey getting to play with Ronnie and the creation of Dream Evil in 1987. Here's Craig Goldie. Quote, "My Dio journey was birthed during the demo recordings for Rough Cut that Ronnie was producing. The 2 of us just liked hanging out together. There were so many times it was just the 2 of us at his home watching old Rainbow videos. It would get too late, and he would bring out the mattress, pillows, blankets, and tuck me in like a father to a child. Then he would bring me headphones so I could listen to the Holy Diver album before it was even released. We would work late at Sound City Studio. One thing that happened there is Ronnie made me a promise that if things did not work out with Vivian, that I would be his first choice. He was impressed how easy and wonderful it was to work together. Once I was in, we only had 6 rehearsals before my first gig with the band. He knew that I knew the songs. I just needed to learn all the little changes they would make to the songs live. The whole thing was surreal from top to bottom. Headlining stage, 20,000-seat arenas. I didn't know what to do with myself at first. I was used to being an opening act. Now it was like I had a city block to run around in. When it came to playing Vivian's solos, I wanted people to know that I could play his solos. They were basically note for note, but I would fudge them a bit to be respectful so that I could move around on stage while I was playing them. We knew we could write together because we had to rewrite some parts for Rough Cut that weren't working. Jimmy and Ronnie would usually start the writing process together, but Jimmy was pretty bummed out because he was so close with Vivian. Ronnie called me and said, "Jimmy isn't really into this right now, so you're up, kid." So him and I just went through our cassettes and picked out all the song ideas we liked. The Rainbow vibes on this one were coming from both of us. I just come from the Blackmore School of Guitar. Ronnie was on board because it was part of his history. He could have said no, but he liked it because it was reminiscent of, not a copy. I thought the riff for Man on the Silver Mountain was so cool that I wanted to surprise Ronnie with one of my own for the song Dream Evil. He was like, "That's a riff." He said he always wanted one like that for his own. The whole album has a Blackmore vibe. That's why I wanted a keyboard solo on All the Fools Sailed Away. Ronnie was like, "Are you sure about this, Goldie?" That one was the first epic track we wrote together. End quote. Sometimes I would go sleep over at my aunt and uncle's house. My uncle played guitar and was a big music buff. I told him some of the bands I was getting into, and he gave me a couple tapes that he didn't want anymore. Double Platinum and Alice Cooper's Greatest Hits. Wow. I was hearing the less metallic 70s versions of Kiss and Alice. Very different, but very good. This would be the beginning of a huge Kiss obsession and a slight Alice Cooper one. I would eventually go back and buy all the Kiss albums. By the following year, they would become my favorite band forever.